I know you're mostly a clinical audience, and many of you are involved in the care and treatment of people living with HIV. So apologies, this is going to be more of an epidemiologic, public health-oriented talk, because I think we need to think about where the epidemic is in this region and where it's going and why. And I think, as you'll see when we get into this, the epidemiology is pretty interesting. It's pretty consistent in the region. It's very telling where the epidemic trends are going, and there are some really profound social justice, human rights, stigma, and discrimination issues that continue to be at the heart of ongoing transmission in this region. So I think those are the themes that I want to explore with you today. So we're going to start talking about the current epidemiology and the treatment coverage. And of course, since we all know now that treatment is a profound preventive intervention, treatment coverage has everything to do with epidemic trajectories. And I think we're all understand that there's still a long way to go in this region to achieve the 90-90-90 targets. I'm then going to talk about key populations, because unfortunately key populations are at the heart of the epidemic in virtually every country in this region. Look at some of the ways forward to address these key population-driven epidemics, and then talk at the end about some of the human rights challenges that we're facing. So this is recent data from UNAIDS, and I think it's important to just kind of lay the general groundwork that we have about 5 million people or so living with HIV in the region, but of course because of the enormous population of the Asia Pacific, that generates a relatively low population level prevalence. About 300,000 new infections in 2015. That is a modest decline, about a 5% decline, but happily a much larger decline in children. About 180,000 deaths, also a decline. So for those of you who take care of patients in this region, thank you. You're doing a wonderful job reducing mortality. That's very important. But the treatment coverage estimate is between 35 and 40% of people in this region. That's low. That is strikingly low for a region that has been involved in HIV for so long and has so many middle and upper income countries. And I think that that is both a clinical and a public health and a human rights challenge to do better on that front. What that translates into is that about 3 million people, adults at least, in the region, and that's a pretty wide confidence interval there, between 2.3 and 3.8, do not have access to antiretroviral therapy in 2015, and although that has bumped up a little bit, we think, in 2016, it's still really unacceptably low. New infections, of course, worldwide, in adults in particular, remain a challenge. So this is from the UNAIDS GAP report. I think it's a very nice summary of where incident infections are. And if you're wondering what that sharp, can I turn this into a pointer? Yes. That sharp curve is, that is the Eastern Europe, Central Asia region, but actually about 85% of that immense increase in HIV is just 2 countries, that's Russia and Ukraine. And that is the part of HIV that is actually expanding most rapidly worldwide. Most of that is a policy failure to address HIV among injection drug users. But that, of course, is a very worrisome trend. Asia Pacific is over here, and pretty much like what you're seeing in other parts of Africa and what we're seeing in North America and other regions, what we would like to see, of course, is a nice decline in new infections, and what you see is, unfortunately, relatively stable, flat incidence. So we are not both treating enough people, and we're not seeing the declines in new infections that we want to see. I think this is a very nice analysis, and using with permission from Dr. Pense and Swarup Sarkar and others, Journal of Viral Eradication, this is very recent, that looks at the Southeast Asia and South Asia region. And what you see up in this corner is the population level prevalence in adults. So this is just general adult prevalence, and all the countries in that nice green color are below 1%. So basically, with the exception of Thailand, there really are not generalized epidemics underway in this region. And that is great news. Now look at the key populations. So among men who have sex with men, virtually everywhere is the highest color. That's over 10% prevalence in maroon. This is what it looks like for injection drug users. Sex workers, a little bit lower. This is mostly female sex workers. If you were looking at male sex workers, it would look even higher than this. And so what we're seeing is a real disconnect. Low general population prevalence and high rates in these very specific key populations. And that's why in my opening comments I said to you, there's a very consistent picture of what HIV looks like in the Asia Pacific. When we look, and this is again from Swarup Sarkar's group, at the coverage of key preventive interventions for these folks, it's a very mixed and heterogeneous picture. And I would point out to you, for example, that when you look at condom use among men who have sex with men, there's a lot of variability. It's not very good in a number of places. Sex workers, pretty much consistently better. But among people who inject drugs, looking at the number of needles per person who injects, and thinking that most injectors inject every day, does anybody think that 6 needles per drug user per year is going to have an impact on reducing transmission? So that's where Thailand is, and that is really very disturbing. That is an ongoing failure to do better, to provide needle and syringe exchange. But a couple of countries are doing better. Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, rather surprisingly, has been doing quite well in harm reduction. But obviously we would like to see these numbers be way better. When we look at the care continuum, you see a picture that is very different and much more heartening. So Thailand, for example, has achieved eradication of perinatal transmission last year, certified by WHO. We should be applauding that. That's a great thing, right? And a number of countries are really doing very well with the 90-90-90 targets, but unfortunately a number of others are not doing so well. And for those of you who haven't seen this paper, I really encourage you to look at it. There's a lot of rich data there. But I want to just reiterate that treatment coverage remains a real problem. So this is WHO's analysis of the treatment data in the region. It's a slightly different set of countries from the SERO ones. But as you can see, if you look at the 90-90-90 targets and say, is there anywhere where we're really reaching those goals? At this point, it's basically Australia. That green color is over 80% of people living with HIV on therapy. Many of the other countries are substantially below that. The yellow color there, which is China, is in the 40 to 60% range. And we know pretty well, both from empirical data and from modeling data, that you have to get treatment levels higher to start to see the prevention benefit. So what are we talking about when we talk about key populations? I think we need to be very specific, and the definition that our group has been using is that key populations are those individuals and communities who have two things. They have a disproportionate burden of HIV and HIV risks and lack of access to essential services, right? So that's the kind of double-edged sword, that they have a higher burden and they're less likely to get testing, prevention, treatment, and care. And that's what makes them key populations. And we use that definition. What emerges right away is that it's gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, sex workers of all genders, people who inject drugs of all genders, transgender women who have sex with men, a very specific group, but with actually the highest burdens and the least access to care of any of these key populations, virtually everywhere. And then, of course, HIV uninfected partners in discordant relationships. And I would just underscore that the adolescents, the youngest age groups from all these key populations, are consistently the groups that have the highest incident infection rates and also the lowest access to care and services. So they are kind of the key of the key. So let's look a little bit at one of these key populations. I'm really just going to focus today on two, and that's because they're two of the most important in this region. That's men who have sex with men, and then we'll talk about people who inject drugs. What I'm going to show you is updated data from a Lancet series that we did in 2012, basically reviewing all the available global data on MSM. And then this has been updated since then. This is all the available incidence data, so where we know that there are not just prevalence, but actually incidence in populations of men who have sex with men. And what I want to point out to you is we started this count in 1995, 1996. So all of you who were clinicians then know what happened in 1996. What happened in 1996? Triple therapy, right? This is the start of the treatment era in Vancouver. And what you want to see is that since treatment has become available, that incident infection has declined. But if you follow these trends over time, what you can see is in fact a scary increase in new infections among men who have sex with men in the treatment era. And if we pull out just the incidence data from the Asia Pacific, there's much less, but basically we have data from China, a couple of data points from India, Taiwan, and Thailand. We see that this trend is really holding and the incidence data is disturbingly high. And I will just point out to you that these lines here, this is 4 per 100 person years, this is 6 per 100 person years, this is 8, this is 10. This is about as high as HIV transmission rates can go in populations. These are extraordinarily high, and these translate into lifetime acquisition probabilities of 60 to 80%. So men in these populations who have sex with other men, if these rates continue, have over half are going to become HIV infected by the time they're mature adults. So we are not on a good trajectory. That is the message. You heard earlier that our colleagues from Hong Kong just released their new recommended strategies for 2017 to 2021. It's a very good document. And this slide is borrowed from there. I didn't have time to ask permission, so I hope I have it. But here it is. And what you're looking at here is basically the attributable fraction over time. So this is 100% of infections starting in 1984, and you can see that most of the infections were in blood donors. That's that color in red. That quickly got cleaned up. There was an injection drug use epidemic here, and of course Hong Kong did a very nice job of responding to people who inject drugs with harm reduction, with methadone, and that has become a tiny proportion, less than 1% of new infections. That is a real success story in this region. But this light blue color is men who have sex with men, gay men and others. And as you can see, and Dr. Chan pointed this out in her comments, this has overtaken all the other sources of HIV infection. This is now the great majority of new infections, and that is really a challenge. And that is pretty consistently being seen across this region. So what's happening? HIV is spreading. HIV rates are high among particularly young MSM in the Asia-Pacific region. And this is in a rapidly changing social and political context, right? This is a sea change that you all are living through in this region. Taiwan looks like maybe is going to move ahead in marriage equality. This is one of the first same-sex couples trying to get married in Taiwan. That also is an applause line, I think. Yeah. And this is, I think it's Taiwan, or it might be Hong Kong Pride, but anyway, just to give you a sense that guys are seriously proud. This is the Adam's Love campaign. Dr. Nitya, one of your program committee chairs, has helped lead very successfully in Thailand. That's very positive and engaging, community involved. This, unfortunately, is a glass pipe that's used to smoke methamphetamine, and that also is a part of the changing context here, that many of these young guys are using substances and mixing substances and sexual risk-taking behavior in ways that have real facilitation of transmission. These are data among the first prospective cohort data from Bangkok. It's a little bit old now, but I'm sharing it with you because this is really a very fundamentally important study. This was done by the Thai-US collaboration, Ministry of Public Health and the CDC, when Frits van Griesenven was there, a distinguished Dutch epidemiologist who started this work. But they basically enrolled a large cohort of HIV uninfected men who had sex with men, followed them prospectively, and provided what was at the time state-of-the-art prevention. So regular HIV testing and counseling, screening and treatment for sexually transmitted infections, free condoms, free water-based lubricant, individualized risk reduction counseling, so basically everything except PrEP. And remember that this is in a country where there's universal access to antiviral therapy and everybody living with HIV gets treated. And what did they, or at least can access free treatment? The treatment coverage is obviously not anywhere near 100%. So the black line, get my pointer here, is all of the men, so 24% or so of them became infected in 60 months or in 5 years. The youngest group is up here in blue. This is 18 to 21-year-olds. And so a third of these guys got infected despite all of that preventive intervention and despite being in a cohort, and those of you who know epidemiology know that there's supposed to be a cohort effect and risk is supposed to decline over time. That's not what you're seeing here. And that is why we think it is really critical to be much more aggressive about PrEP, about pre-exposure prophylaxis, which I'm going to talk about later, because the basics of HIV prevention for this population are necessary but insufficient. And we're also seeing an impact of this, and I showed you that data from Bangkok, at a molecular level. And the molecular findings are really very important. So when we reviewed this in 2012, this was basically all the available molecular epi data on subtypes of HIV in men who have sex with men globally. I won't get into all the details here except to just point out that for the region, the majority of infections in Thailand were with the AE recombinant. This is, for those of you who are interested in the virology, CRF01AE. It's a recombinant virus that has been predominant in Thailand. That had also turned up to some extent in China and in Singapore. But several years later, we now have a very different picture. This is a systematic review that a graduate student of mine did, looking at all the published data from the region. And this is just HIV subtypes in MSM. And you can see that the CRF01AE, that's the blue color, has become the predominant virus among men who have sex with men in the region. And subtype B, which was the earlier predominant virus, is now being seen in about a quarter. Now that is a real change. This is what mainland China looks like, and China, of course, is driving this, and in Thailand, it's overwhelmingly the majority virus. So what that tells you is that this is not just happening as a national trend issue. This is a regional epidemic, and there is a regional convergence, at least at a viral level, and a lot of that is because Bangkok is the capital of the party that is going on for these young men. It's the largest male commercial sex scene in the world. And if you look through the literature on this, you'll see that lots of people, not necessarily explicitly understanding that connection, but nevertheless pointing out what is happening. So Thailand is the top destination for tourism from China for the first decade of China's free travel policy, and it was the first country to allow Chinese citizens to come without a visa. MSM contacts is becoming a major route of local CRF01AE transmission in Hong Kong. That's a relatively recent report. And the dominant genetic forms of HIV changed from B to AE among MSM in China, and that's from a paper from 2014. So this really looks real, and it's dramatic, and suggests the work that really has to happen at a regional level. So what about people who inject drugs? Well, last year we did a commission with The Lancet and Johns Hopkins. Adiba was one of our commission co-chairs on drug policy and health. This is a very recent global review of the available data looking at prevalence among people who inject drugs, that's in blue, compared to prevalence in the general population, which is that color that you can barely see. And there are a number of countries in the region. So Indonesia actually has the most extreme epidemic among PWID. Second is Pakistan. Third is Myanmar. Thailand is here in fifth. Malaysia is here. Vietnam is here. So people who inject drugs in this region also have a seriously disproportionate burden. And of course, they are much less likely to be treated. This is from that same Lancet commission, and what you're looking at here is the proportion of drug users who are living with HIV and receiving antiretroviral therapy. So in Western Europe, North America, and Australia, it's very good. It's close to 100%. to fit all these data on one slide, we had to use a log scale. So for this region, what you're actually looking at is about 5% coverage of antiviral therapy. That is disastrously low, right? For Eastern Europe and Central Asia, it's actually under 1%. That is just about a crime against humanity. And for Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, is a very, very low proportion of drug users, but nevertheless, it's under 1% are actually accessing antiviral therapy. In both of these regions, drug use is basically seen, or active drug use, as reasons for exclusion. But of course, the big change in this region is not just injection drug use, and most of the MSM epidemic does not involve injection drug use. It involves non-injection drug use of stimulants, amphetamine-like substances, methamphetamine. Just to say, this is from the World Drug Report 2012, but China was the country in this region that had the largest, at least, volume of seizures of methamphetamine. And of course, unfortunately, Myanmar is the largest exporter in the region and producer. So these drugs are widely available and cheap, and I don't have to tell all of you that they are a big part of your epidemic. But good old injection drug use is still there and still an issue. This is some very nice work from colleagues of mine at Hopkins and at YRG Care in Chennai, India, who have been doing large population level studies of two key populations. They've been looking at men who have sex with men in India and people who inject drugs. And what you're looking at here is, I think, a very important comparison. I'm sorry if this gets a little bit into the epidemiologic weeds, but here you have prevalence of HIV among people who inject drugs. So the northeast states of India, these are places that have had very severe epidemics for a long time, 45% prevalence, 31% prevalence. Some other cities and areas in central part of the country that also have a significant burden. But what they did was basically use a multi-algorithm assay to take cross-sectional samples and do an incidence assessment on those. So you're able to say, okay, what about new infections? What do new infections look like? And in fact, this epidemic in Northeast India is pretty much over, except here. Very low rates of new infection. But the center and north of India showing extremely high rates of new infection. And for example, this city of Kanpur at 12% incidence, again, is about as high as HIV transmission can go. I bring this up because it's important to keep in mind, you'll see that there's lots and lots of prevalence data out there. It does not inform prevention as well, of course, as incidence. But this is what their data look like in terms of continuum of care. So this is MSM and people who inject drugs. The numbers here are really impressively large. They did basically big samples in 27 sites. And the bad news is, as you can see, there's a huge drop-off in terms of people aware of testing. That drop-off kind of continues through the continuum. And when you finally get down to the proportion who are virally suppressed, it's 10% of MSM and 15% of people who use drugs. That is, again, really unacceptably low. So what are we going to do about this? What are the ways forward? I think the WHO new guidelines from 2015 lay this out in exquisitely simple terms. Treat all people living with HIV, so you have got to get your treatment numbers up. And antivirals should be looked at as additional prevention for people at substantial risk. And certainly this young MSM population in your region, transgender women and maybe others, meet those criteria. So where are we with PrEP access in the Asia Pacific? So no country in the region, at least that I'm aware of, is providing PrEP now as part of national health. And that includes Thailand, where some of the very first trials were done. Thailand has approved Truvada for PrEP and also a generic Tino-EM, which is basically the same, tenofovir emtricitabine, but basically conducting pilots, or people can pay out of pocket. India and China both have had demonstration projects. Australia has done something of a hybrid where there's actually some states that have basically essentially PrEP access through an implementation science approach. And the Hong Kong strategy does call for local PrEP demonstrations, so that's really encouraging. But all of us should keep in mind that PrEP efficacy for MSM was demonstrated in 2011. So that's a long time ago now. It's 2017. So 6 years we've known that this works. So the demonstration projects really need to be large-scale, rapidly implemented, adapted to local use, and start having an impact. So there are many prevention tools that we need to implement. But as I said, ARVs for prevention, we know this has been spectacularly successful in the region for PMTCT, so why not for PrEP? And of course, treatment as prevention is going to be key as well. We have a very exciting number of new tools coming on stream for prevention, many of which we think are going to have impacts for this population. But if we can't deal with the stigma and discrimination issues and the low coverage and low uptake of services, these are not going to have the impact that PrEP and treatment are also not having. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time, and let me move on to a couple of the human rights points that I really want to make. So we're all going to miss Ban Ki-moon. He was, of course, the UN Secretary General from this region, and he was very explicit about the universality of human rights, particularly as how it relates to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people. Direct quote from him, "Let me say this loud and clear. LGBT people are entitled to the same rights as everyone else. They too are born free and equal." So that's a very fundamental assertion of the fact that LGBT people also have a right to health care, and they have a right, I think, at this point to PrEP. We need to see that as a human rights issue and not just as an implementation issue. Drug users have a right to life too, and of course, one of the worst things that's happening in this region is this war on drug users in the Philippines. Human Rights Watch did a recent report on this, 2017, which was entitled License to Kill. It's now over 7,000 extrajudicial executions of drug users. Those people, by the way, are not killed. They're protesters, but they are laying out on cardboard because that's actually what often happens in the streets of Manila. And they made the point, this is one of the incredibly overcrowded prisons and jails in the Philippines that now are full of drug users, that not only is this a human rights violation, but it also is significant, having significant negative public health consequences, drives drug users underground, and we already know that these kinds of wars on drugs can fuel HIV and hepatitis C among people who use drugs, discourage people from seeking effective treatment services. This is not the way forward. There is, of course, also targeted killings happening in Chechnya. Many of you will be aware of that. And we have seen a real retreat on LGBT rights, most recently in Indonesia, with people a couple being caned in Banda Aceh, arrests and crackdowns. These are from media sources, so not just arresting and harassing people, but also publicly humiliating and shaming them. This, again, is not going to help with HIV prevention, right? This is going so much in the wrong direction. And the human rights community, this is from Out Loud, Outright Action International, Jessica Stern, actually sees a Trump effect in some of this. And I would encourage those of you who are interested to look at this piece. A Trump effect is endangering LGBT people, and not just because of the rule of law. It is this notion that human rights are universal and sacred that we have backed away from, and that I think we have to really look to, again, those words from Ban Ki-moon. What we are talking about is that people have a right to the basics of health care, to dignity, to life. And we are really seeing this region going through some convulsions around equity, social justice, human rights. Those things are likely to impact HIV uptake, prevention, use, services. I know many of you share the same level of concern that I do, but I really think that this is a threat to the success of the HIV effort. Happily, we also have some new allies. The UN, for the first time now, has a sexual orientation and gender identity independent expert named with the specific human rights mandate of investigating rights abuses against LGBT people. He's a distinguished Thai legal scholar, Vitit Montabarn. I'll share with you that the vote was incredibly close. He was almost not, though he made it by 6 votes in the UN General Assembly, but nevertheless, he has now been installed in that post, and he has a 3-year mandate to investigate anti-LGBTQ abuses. And we are really delighted that the UN has taken that step and that there's going to be at least one body within the UN system that's going to be looking at these rights issues. So we have a long way to go. As I said, treatment access and treatment coverage in the region is too low. The rollout of PrEP has been slow. The epidemic continues among particularly young men who have sex with men and people who inject drugs. And there has been a series of real challenges to social justice and human rights. And when you put that all together, I don't mean to depress you at the beginning of your meeting, but I think you all have your work cut out for you. We certainly do in my country as well. And I think we all understand as healthcare providers that healthcare is a right, that dignity is a right, and that supporting people in being able to make safe and healthy choices really also requires engaging with these communities at risk and doing what we can to try and help protect people in these very challenging environments. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I'd also like to thank you for all the work that you do and say we're all in this together. Thank you.